It was a yearly ritual, but it felt more like a mandatory worship service. The Boyd Industries Family Conference was less about discussing business plans and more about paying homage at the shrine of John Boyd himself. This was the individual who had constructed his domain on two foundations, concrete and authority. John Boyd didn't merely distribute construction supplies, he distributed assurance. He was the living embodiment of the American success story, the individual who began with a corroded pickup and now controlled half the industrial complex outside Indianapolis. Everyone was familiar with his narrative because he ensured they were, an unrelenting saga of sacrifice, dawn shifts, and the absolute unquestionable strength of discipline. The auditorium at Boyd headquarters was cutting edge, all buffed chrome and navy carpeting. It carried the faint scent of fresh wealth and corporate aspiration. Row after row of workers sat assembled, many accompanied by their partners and anxious children. Attendance was compulsory, naturally. John Boyd didn't request, he decreed. On the platform, illuminated by a spotlight that rendered his charcoal suit almost metallic, stood John Boyd. He was 55, slim, fierce, and possessed the kind of angular jaw that appeared carved from stone. He didn't simply talk, he proclaimed. "Observe your surroundings," John's voice thundered, magnified sufficiently to vibrate the inexpensive water glass on the lectern. "Observe this structure, observe the security you possess. Do you comprehend why you have this? Do you comprehend why you can be seated here today, protected, knowing your offspring will be cared for?" He halted, allowing the quiet to develop. He was an expert of the theatrical pause. Because of structure. Because of the steadfast implementation of discipline. Because, while the remainder of society is pursuing fleeting excitement and momentary profits, we here at Boyd Industries comprehend that the sole genuine route to prosperity, to ethical standing, to succeeding properly, is through complete self-restraint. He traversed the length of the platform, his actions crisp and rehearsed. He had delivered this address, or variations of it, countless times. Every syllable reinforced his meticulously manufactured identity. John Boyd wasn't merely accomplished, he was flawless. He was the breadwinner who never stumbled, the patriarch whose accounts were as pristine and systematic as his desk pad. In the fourth row from the rear, adjacent to the emergency door, sat Helena. Helena was a junior assistant in HR, a role she had maintained for 4 years without a single advancement, raise, or error. She was the epitome of silent conformity. She wore a plain gray skirt suit, her dark hair secured severely. She despised these conferences. They were too noisy, too bright, and required too much concentrated attention, which only amplified her nervousness about accidentally dropping her coffee or establishing eye contact with a senior administrator. Helena was frightened of John Boyd, not because he shouted, but because he was so exact. His perfection required perfection from everyone around him, and the terror of being the defective component was a persistent low-level hum in the rear of her consciousness. She maintained her gaze locked on the platform, absorbing the phrases but concentrating primarily on the inanimate items around the CEO. It was safer that approach. She observed the stack of printed documents lying precisely to John's right on the lectern. They were presentation notes, copies of his recent publication, perhaps some charts. They were crisp, professionally printed and arranged. Everything John handled was arranged. But as John motioned emphatically toward a large display showing the word sacrifice in bold black type, Helena's eyes detected something tucked into the center of the stack. It was a single sheet of paper, folded in half, but not entirely concealed. Helena worked with documents throughout the day. Her brain analyzed paper texture, weight, and format instantly. This particular sheet of paper was slightly off-white, cheaper material than the glossy presentation handouts. More significantly, she identified the faint, stylized eagle emblem visible near the top edge of the folded paper. She froze. It was the emblem for the First Commerce and Trust Bank. Helena knew that emblem intimately. It was the bank she utilized for her modest savings account, the one where her direct deposit landed, the one that dispatched those incredibly tedious, yet critically significant, official notifications. Her heart gave a small skip,
a momentary sharp panic that her account was somehow incorrect. She immediately instructed herself to look elsewhere. It was probably just a quarterly statement John required for a tax discussion. It was nothing. But John was now leaning into the microphone, his voice dripping with moral authority. I hear individuals complain about work-life balance. Nonsense. Balance is what you accomplish when you have constructed a framework so strong, so financially secure, that the winds of economic downturn cannot reach you. You sacrifice today for the unshakable foundation of tomorrow. He threw his arms wide open, inviting the audience to appreciate his framework. And then his daughter walked onto the platform. Her name was Clara. She was maybe 8 years old, dressed in a tasteful, expensive sundress, clearly uncomfortable being displayed as a visual example. John had brought her up to demonstrate the results of his discipline, a well-adjusted, appreciative child who wanted for nothing.
"This," John declared, placing a heavy, possessive hand on her shoulder, "is what security looks like. My children comprehend the worth of $1 because I taught them that money is not enchantment. It is the natural outcome of structure." Clara gave a practiced, slight smile. She stood awkwardly beside the lectern, gazing out at the ocean of faces, clearly wishing she were somewhere else entirely. Her eyes drifted to the stack of papers. Perhaps out of boredom, or perhaps just natural childish curiosity about anything her father was using as a prop, she reached out with small fingers. Her fingers closed around the stack. She lifted them slightly, struggling a bit with the weight. The single folded piece of cheap paper, the one Helena had recognized, slipped loose from the middle of the pile and fluttered down onto the dark wood of the lectern. Clara, being helpful in the way 8-year-olds are when they want to please their parents, bent down to retrieve it. John was still talking, deep into a parable about the necessity of denying oneself small pleasures, his eyes closed for emphasis. Clara smoothed the paper out with both hands, holding it flat against the dark wood. She didn't have her father's laser focus on the crowd. She was just looking at the strange words printed in the stark official font of First Commerce and Trust Bank. Her small face scrunched up in concentration as she tried to make sense of the grown-up words. Helena, sitting in the back, felt a sudden, icy wave of dread. She knew that paper had no business being there. It looked exactly like the urgent red flag notices her own bank sent when things were going seriously wrong.
Clara tilted her head, reading the document silently for a moment, her lips moving slightly as she sounded out the bigger words. Then, perhaps because she thought it was part of the presentation, like the charts and graphs her daddy always used, or perhaps because she genuinely didn't understand what any of it meant and wanted to ask, she leaned slightly toward the microphone on her tiptoes, holding the paper up in both hands. "Daddy?" she said in that high, clear voice that only 8-year-olds have, interrupting John mid-sentence. John opened one eye, irritated at the interruption in his rhythm. "Yes, sweetie?" he asked, his voice still booming into the mic, though now edged with impatience, and a hint of that forced patience parents use when their children interrupt important grown-up things. Clara pointed to a line near the bottom with one small finger, her brow furrowed in confusion. She read the words aloud slowly and carefully, the way children read when they're trying to pronounce everything correctly, her voice clear, young, and entirely lacking in any understanding of the gravity of what she was saying. It cut right through the massive auditorium. "It says here," she paused, squinting at a longer word, "M-me-d-8 reg-u-lay-tor re-action required. Your primary business credit line account 8874B has been temporarily frozen due to continuous and severe overdraft status. Please contact the Office of Debt Resolution immediately to avoid further legal proceedings." She looked up at her father with wide, confused eyes. "Daddy, what does frozen mean? Like ice cream frozen?" The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical pressure, thick and heavy, that settled instantaneously on every person seated in the auditorium. John Boyd, the man who preached financial stability and untouchable structure, stopped moving entirely. His mouth was slightly open, frozen in the middle of the word responsibility.
The spotlight seemed to intensify the sweat suddenly beading on his forehead. Helena, in the back row, felt her face flush hot, then cold. She was staring at the back of John's head, but she could feel the collective shock of the 300 people around her. No one corrected Clara. No one moved to take the paper away. The daughter of the great John Boyd stood holding the proof that the foundation of the empire was not unshakable after all, looking at her father with innocent confusion, completely unaware that she had just detonated a bomb. A senior manager in the front row, a man named Gary who ran logistics and was known for his nervous energy, cleared his throat. The sound was horribly loud in the vacuum of the silence. Helena dropped her gaze immediately, staring intently at the pattern of the blue carpet. Her heart was hammering, but her mind was calculating. How fast could she possibly disappear? The conference did not continue. The audience remained seated, but they were no longer listening to the man on the platform. They were listening to the echo of the bank notice, read in the innocent voice of an 8-year-old girl. John Boyd's flawless identity, constructed over decades of relentless discipline, had just been shredded by a cheap piece of paper and the unknowing voice of his own child. The spotlight remained on him, mercilessly illuminating the sudden, profound fear in his eyes. He looked down at his daughter, who was still holding the notice, her small face confused by the sudden dramatic change in the room's atmosphere. She clutched the paper with both hands, looking around nervously, sensing something was wrong, but not understanding what. He tried to speak, but the words caught somewhere deep in his throat.
Clara looked up at her father, her brow furrowed, her bottom lip trembling slightly. "Daddy?" she whispered again, her voice smaller now, scared. "Did I do something bad? What does frozen mean?" John couldn't answer. He simply reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently took the paper from her small fingers. He didn't crumple it. He just held the damning evidence flat in his palm, staring at the bold print. It was impossible to pretend the words hadn't been spoken. Everyone knew. The CEO of Boyd Industries, the prophet of financial control, was living in an overdraft. The silence stretched, agonizingly. The employees who had been taught to revere John's success were now processing the fact that their stability, the very security John had just been boasting about, was built on a shaky, possibly collapsing structure of debt. If you're enjoying this story about how a single truth can bring down an empire of lies, hit that like button right now, and stick around until the end because you won't believe what Helena does next. Helena risked a quick glance up. John was still frozen, his head bowed slightly over the paper. Clara stood beside him, looking up at him with worried eyes, her small hands clasped together nervously. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was pure, unadulterated humiliation. He had lost control of his narrative, and in the world of John Boyd, losing the narrative was the ultimate failure. A woman in the second row, the wife of the head of sales, made a small, involuntary sound, a gasp that was quickly smothered by her hand. John slowly lifted his head. His eyes swept over the silent faces in the audience. They weren't the admiring, deferential looks he was accustomed to. They were calculating, questioning, and worst of all, pitying. He knew instantly that the conference was over. Everything he was about to say, about future projections, about upcoming bonuses, about the moral superiority of Boyd employees, was meaningless. The foundation had cracked. He cleared his throat, a deep, rattling sound that was a poor imitation of Gary's nervous cough. "Thank you, Clara," he managed, his voice sounding dry and thin, stripped of its former booming authority. He folded the paper meticulously, the sound of the crisp fold echoing unnaturally in the quiet room. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I didn't mean to." Her small voice was shaking. "It's fine, sweetie," John said automatically, but his voice lacked warmth. He placed the folded paper back on the lectern, this time carefully tucking it under his notes, as if that could somehow undo the last 2 minutes. "Go find Mommy, okay?" Clara nodded quickly, a tear running down her cheek, and hurried off the stage, clearly knowing she'd done something terribly wrong, even if she didn't understand what.
John tried to salvage the situation with a forced smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, a little technical misunderstanding. Just some minor restructuring details that we are finalizing with the bank. Nothing for anyone here to be concerned about. He paused, waiting for the collective nod, the murmurs of reassurance. They didn't come. The audience remained stone still, watching him. They had heard frozen credit line and urgent debt resolution read aloud by an 8-year-old child. They knew what minor restructuring looked like, and it wasn't that. John's eyes flickered across the room, searching for a friendly face, a loyalist who would jump in and change the subject. His gaze briefly swept over Helena in the back. She immediately hunched her shoulders, trying to meld into the carpet. He forced himself to continue, returning to his prepared remarks, but the momentum was gone. He was talking about efficiency metrics, but his voice was shaky, and the audience was watching the folded paper on the lectern. It was like watching a perfectly constructed sandcastle dissolve in a rising tide. Every subsequent word he spoke only emphasized the lie that had just been exposed. He was supposed to be the master of his domain, the guarantor of their futures, and now they knew he was scrambling to keep the lights on. After 2 more painful minutes of John stammering through irrelevant statistics, Gary, the nervous manager, stood up abruptly. He didn't speak to John, he spoke to the audience. "Folks, I think we'll take a quick break," Gary announced, his voice tight. "Let's stretch our legs. Refreshments are available outside the hall." It was a clear, necessary intervention, a mercy killing of the conference. John glared at Gary, but Gary avoided his eyes, already ushering people out of the rows. The employees stood up, but they didn't move quickly. They moved with a strange, hesitant deliberation, avoiding eye contact with John and often casting quick, nervous glances at each other. They were exchanging information non-verbally. "Did you hear that? What does this mean?" Clara, sensing she had somehow messed up badly, had already disappeared into the side exit where her mother was waiting, leaving her father alone on the platform. John Boyd stood there, watching his captive audience dissolve into small, whispering groups. The stability he had preached about was gone, replaced by sudden, widespread uncertainty. Helena, moving quickly and silently, slipped out the back door nearest her seat, needing fresh air and distance. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this single piece of paper would change everything at Boyd Industries. The man who taught them how to succeed properly had just failed, publicly and spectacularly, and she, the quiet clerk, had been the first to see the weapon. She kept walking, moving fast down the long, empty corridor, trying to outrun the sound of Clara's innocent voice reading the death notice of John Boyd's authority. It was Monday morning, and the foundation of Boyd Industries had crumbled before lunch. The long, fluorescent-lit corridor outside the main auditorium was usually reserved for the quiet hum of corporate efficiency. Now, it was a pressure cooker of hushed, frantic conversation. Helena leaned against the cool plaster wall, several yards away from the main cluster of people near the coffee station. She felt like a phantom, unnoticed, which was exactly how she preferred it. She gripped the strap of her sensible handbag, trying to regulate her breathing. The fear of John Boyd was still there, but it was now mixed with a strange, cold clarity. The employees were drinking coffee and whispering, but the energy in the room was electric, like standing too close to a high-tension wire. This wasn't a coffee break, it was an impromptu crisis meeting managed by the lowest common denominator: gossip. "A frozen credit line," she heard a woman from accounting hiss to her colleague. "That's not a tax issue, Brenda. That's a payroll issue." "And he was up there talking about sacrifice," the colleague whispered back, her voice laced with outrage that bordered on betrayal. "My husband just authorized a new truck lease based on John's forecast this morning."
Helena knew they were right. Boyd Industries ran on credit, like any major construction supplier. If the bank had frozen the primary business line, it meant suppliers weren't getting paid, and soon, neither would the employees. John Boyd's discipline wasn't the foundation. The bank's good faith was, and that faith had just been withdrawn, publicly. She saw Gary, the nervous logistics manager who had called the impromptu break, standing near the refreshment table, trying desperately to look like he was in control. He was talking into his phone, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes darting toward the double doors of the auditorium, clearly waiting for John Boyd to emerge and somehow fix the irreversible damage. But John wasn't coming out. He had vanished immediately into the private back offices, leaving the chaos he'd inadvertently created to fester. John Boyd didn't handle messes. He outsourced them. Helena knew she needed to get back to her desk in HR, but she couldn't move yet. Her job was processing personnel files and managing initial onboarding paperwork. She was the definition of replaceable. If the company was going under, the HR department would be the first to be downsized. Or worse, she would be trapped there, processing the termination papers of everyone she knew, including herself. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sudden, intense wave of anxiety. Focus on the small things, she told herself. Focus on the task. But the task now was survival. Suddenly, a massive surge of footsteps came down the main executive hallway, headed straight for the auditorium. It was Mark Jensen, the company's stoic, gray-haired CFO, flanked by two lawyers in expensive, somber suits. Mark's face was a mask of furious concentration. Gary practically leaped away from the coffee station to intercept them. "Mark, thank God, did you see?" Gary started, his voice cracking. Mark cut him off with a sharp, slicing gesture of his hand. "I saw enough, Gary. Where is he?"
In his office, sir. He hasn't said anything. He just... Gary trailed off, unable to articulate the sheer collapse of authority they had witnessed. Get the executive team into the conference room adjacent to his office, now. No phones, no leaks. We have 20 minutes before the market opens and this hits the news feeds, Mark commanded, his voice low and sharp, entirely devoid of the reverence usually reserved for John Boyd. Helena listened, her ears straining. 20 minutes. That was the window they had to spin the disaster. She realized that the immediate danger wasn't John's humiliation, it was the operational halt. The bank's action wasn't a warning, it was a hammer blow. She finally moved, slipping down a side stairwell reserved for facility staff. She needed the anonymity of the lower floors. She found a quiet break room in the basement, meant for maintenance crews, and sat down hard on a plastic chair. She pulled out her phone, not to call anyone, but to check the time. 11:45 a.m. Lunch break usually started at noon. She opened the bank app on her phone, First Commerce and Trust. Her own tiny savings account was fine, of course, but seeing the logo again, the same stylized eagle that had doomed John Boyd, made her stomach clench. She started thinking about the logistics, the cold, hard reality that John had just tried to dismiss as a technical misunderstanding. If the credit line was frozen, the company couldn't access working capital. They couldn't pay for the gas in the delivery trucks. They couldn't pay the iron ore supplier whose invoice was due tomorrow. And most critically for the employees, they couldn't run payroll next Friday. John Boyd, the man who preached financial infallibility, had bankrupted his own moral authority and potentially his company, all because he couldn't keep a piece of paper off his lectern.
Upstairs, in the hushed, mahogany-paneled executive conference room, the air was thick with the smell of expensive, panicked cologne. John Boyd was pacing behind his custom-made cherry-wood desk, ignoring the three men seated opposite him: Mark Jensen, CFO, Gary, Logistics, and Alan, General Counsel. John was no longer the silver-suited god of discipline. His tie was loosened, his face was flushed, and his eyes held a predatory glint of sheer terror masked by rage. "It's a disgrace," John spat, slamming his hand down on the desk. The sound echoed painfully. "A goddamn setup. That bank is trying to strong-arm me into a higher interest rate. They saw an opportunity and they took it." Alan, the general counsel, cleared his throat delicately. "John, respectfully, the bank doesn't issue a notice of immediate regulatory action just to haggle over points. We received 3 warnings last week, which were forwarded to you. The line was frozen because the operating account has been consistently used to cover personal asset liquidity, namely the mortgage on the Florida property." John whirled around, pointing a shaky finger at Alan. "That's my money. I built this empire. I can move my money wherever damn well please. It's the bank's incompetence that allowed that notice to fall into the wrong hands." Mark Jensen, the CFO, leaned forward, his expression grim. He wasn't afraid of John. He was afraid of prison. "John, the bank notice wasn't the problem. The fact that it was true is the problem. We have $4.2 million in immediate obligations due in the next 3 business days. Our primary line is zeroed out. We cannot issue payment for the concrete shipment arriving in 4 hours. That shipment is tied to the Indianapolis municipal contract.
If we miss that delivery, we are in default, and the penalties will cripple us. The weight of Mark's words finally seemed to penetrate John's fury. He stopped pacing.
So fix it, John barked. Call the bank manager. I want a personal meeting. I'll fly him out here. I'll show him the books. I'll make him understand that Boyd Industries is too big to fail over a technicality.
We have been trying, John, Mark said, his voice flat. The bank isn't interested in personal assurances anymore. They want immediate collateralization of the outstanding debt, or they will proceed with legal action against the company's assets. They know we are exposed. The room went silent again, heavier than the silence in the auditorium. They were discussing the inevitable, the potential collapse of a multi-million-dollar corporation built entirely on the illusion of stability. John walked over to the window, staring out at the expansive parking lot filled with the cars of his now terrified employees. He had to regain control. His identity was everything. "We need a narrative," John said, his voice regaining a fraction of his former steely command. "We tell the employees and the press that this is hostile action, a temporary liquidity crunch caused by aggressive, predatory banking practices. We assure them that all future payrolls are secure." Gary shifted uncomfortably. "But are they secure, John? If we can't unlock the line, where is next Friday's payroll coming from?" John glared at him. "We liquidate something. That's what we do. We sell the jet, we sell the property in Arizona, we find the cash. But first," he turned back to the desk, his eyes narrowing, "we deal with the leak." "The leak?" Alan asked, confused. "That paper," he hissed, pointing to the spot on the lectern where the notice had rested. "Who put that notice on the lectern stack? It was administrative incompetence. I want to know who was responsible for preparing those materials. I want them fired by the end of the day. This humiliation was caused by a simple administrative error, and that person will pay for it." He wasn't concerned about the debt. He was concerned about the optics of the debt. Alan sighed internally. The witch hunt had begun. It was always easier for John to blame a clerk than to admit his own reckless borrowing. "I'll have Martha pull the records of who handled the conference prep materials," Alan confirmed, already dreading the task of interviewing John's executive assistant. Downstairs, Helena was still sitting in the break room, feeling the cold dread solidify into a painful knot in her chest. She knew that the hunt for the person responsible for the paper was already underway. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had been the first person to recognize the emblem, and she knew exactly how careless John had been to leave such a damning document unsecured. But the responsibility would land squarely on some poor administrative assistant or clerk who handled the printing. Helena was safe because she was an HR clerk, not an executive assistant. She didn't touch John's personal papers, but she knew the administrative staff. She knew the meticulous, slightly frazzled woman named Susan who usually oversaw the printing for these events. Susan was a single mother who couldn't afford to lose her job. Helena stood up, the chair scraping loudly on the linoleum floor. She had to go back to her desk. Hiding was suspicious. Acting normal was the only way to survive. As she walked back toward the main HR office, she passed a copy room. The door was ajar, and she heard Susan, the administrative assistant, sobbing softly inside. Martha, John's long-suffering executive assistant, tried to comfort her. "He said he's going to fire whoever printed the materials," Martha whispered, her voice rough. "Susan, did you see that paper? Did you put it in the stack?"
"I don't know, Martha. I don't know," Susan wailed. "I printed 50 copies of the Discipline Manifesto and then organized the notes for the lectern. I must have grabbed something from the top of the pile from the shredding bin, or maybe it was just stuck to the bottom of the book copies. It was late last night. I didn't look closely." Martha sighed heavily. "He doesn't care, Susan. He just needs a public head on a platter to distract from the frozen line. He's already calling Alan to start the termination paperwork." Helena stopped dead in the hallway, unseen but listening intently. John wasn't just demanding a resignation. He was demanding a scapegoat immediately. This wasn't about accountability. It was about image preservation at the expense of someone's life. She walked away quickly, her mind racing. Susan was about to lose her job, her stability, her income, all because John Boyd had been sloppy and arrogant enough to bring proof of his failure to the stage. Helena sat down at her cubicle in the quiet, sterile environment of the HR office. Her job was to process the paperwork once Alan sent it over. She would be the one typing Susan's termination letter, citing gross negligence in handling confidential corporate documents.
She stared at her keyboard. She was frightened of John Boyd. She was frightened of making a mistake. Her entire career at Boyd Industries had been defined by staying small, quiet, and compliant. But watching John's arrogance shatter, and now witnessing his immediate, brutal pivot to sacrificing an innocent, low-level employee to save his own reputation, something shifted inside Helena. It wasn't bravery, not yet. It was a cold, quiet anger, the deep, simmering resentment of years of being told to sacrifice and comply by a man who was himself reckless and dishonest. She realized she knew something critical that John didn't know she knew. She knew the paper was a red flag notice, not just a random document. She had recognized the emblem and the gravity before anyone else. If John Boyd was looking for a scapegoat, he was looking for someone who caused the problem. Susan might have handled the paper, but John had brought it from his private office. Helena opened a blank document on her computer, her fingers hovering over the keys. She began typing up a standard termination form, waiting for the official order from Alan. The next few hours were a blur of hushed phone calls and frantic, tightly controlled meetings. The break never officially ended. Employees were simply told to return to their desks and wait for further instructions, creating an atmosphere of paralyzed anticipation. John and his executive team were locked in the conference room, trying to secure emergency bridge funding from a smaller regional bank, any bank that hadn't yet seen the news or heard the rumors. Mark Jensen, the CFO, emerged briefly, his face etched with exhaustion. He went straight to his assistant. Cancel all outgoing payments over $5,000. Hold the wire transfer for the supply chain in Ohio. We are on cash-only survival mode until further notice. This confirmed Helena's worst fears. The company was essentially insolvent right now. The stability John had boasted about was a mirage. Around 3 p.m., Alan, the general counsel, walked into the HR office, looking severely stressed. He approached Helena's supervisor, a woman named Carol, who was already dreading this conversation. "Carol, I need you to process a termination immediately," Alan said, keeping his voice low. "Susan Miller, administrative support, gross negligence. She placed sensitive, confidential financial documents on the CEO's lectern, leading to a massive security breach and corporate humiliation."
Carol looked miserable.
"Alan, Susan is a great worker. Can't we just give her a warning? She's been here 8 years.
"No," Alan said sharply, glancing nervously toward the main corridor. "John needs this done today. He needs to show the market that the situation is contained and the error was administrative, not financial management. Process the paperwork. I need her escorted out of the building in 30 minutes. Carol turned to Helena. "Helena, you handled the termination paperwork. Make sure it's airtight. We don't want any grounds for a wrongful termination suit." Helena nodded silently. This was it, the moment of absolute compliance. She opened the template file. She started typing, "Employee, Susan Miller. Department, Administration. Reason for termination, gross negligence." As her fingers typed the words, she felt the quiet anger from before rise up again. John Boyd was sacrificing Susan to protect his lie. Helena stopped typing. She looked down at the documents on her desk. She had her own personnel file, her employee handbook, and a copy of the Boyd Industries Code of Conduct, which John had personally written. The code emphasized integrity and transparency above all. She thought about the bank notice, the cheap, off-white paper, the emblem, the terrifying words, account 8874B, temporarily frozen. She knew what she had to do, and it was terrifying. Subscribe to the channel right now because stories like this, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage, are exactly the kind of content we post here every week. It was career suicide. It was a direct confrontation with the granite-jawed man who demanded perfection and absolute obedience. But she couldn't watch Susan, the innocent scapegoat, be destroyed for John's colossal mistake. Helena saved the termination draft, then closed it. She opened a new document. She typed a single sentence, "To the attention of John Boyd, CEO, and the executive committee." She then typed a list of bullet points, meticulously referencing the code of conduct and the events she had witnessed. She wrote about the emblem, the specific account number, and the required regulatory action. Details only someone who had read the paper or worked with the bank notices would know. She didn't accuse John directly of debt, but she accused him of sacrificing an employee to cover up a critical operational failure that threatened the stability of the entire company, violating the very integrity he preached. She finished the document,
It was short, precise, and utterly damning. It was an anonymous whistleblower report written on company letterhead that shifted the blame from the administrative error, Susan, back onto the source of the financial failure, John. She looked at the clock. 3:15 p.m. Susan was about to be called in. Helena stood up, her legs shaking. She printed the document and folded it carefully. She knew she couldn't just email it. John would delete it, and Alan would trace the IP address instantly. She had to deliver it physically, and she had to deliver it where it would cause the maximum damage and ensure the executive team saw it before John could intercept it. The executive team was still locked in the conference room adjacent to John's office. Helena walked out of the HR department, moving with the same quiet, almost invisible efficiency that had defined her 4 years at Boyd Industries. This time, however, she wasn't hiding. She was attacking. She took the elevator up to the executive floor, a floor she rarely visited. It was plush and quiet, the carpet thick enough to muffle footsteps. She saw Martha, John's assistant, sitting at her desk, looking utterly defeated, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. She had just finished the difficult task of telling Susan to report to HR in a few minutes. Helena walked past Martha's desk without stopping, heading straight toward the conference room door.
"Excuse me, miss," Martha called out, startled. "You can't go in there. Mr. Boyd is in a critical meeting." Helena stopped. She didn't look at Martha. She simply reached out and slipped the folded letter underneath the heavy oak door of the conference room. It slid silently across the deep blue carpet. Martha stared at the paper lying on the floor outside the door, then back at Helena, confusion written all over her face. Helena didn't explain. She didn't need to. She turned around and walked back toward the elevator, her heart thumping against her ribs like a drum. She knew that paper would be found within minutes. She returned to her desk in HR, sat down, and waited. She didn't look at Carol, who was shuffling Susan's personnel file. She didn't look at the empty termination form on her screen. She just waited for the explosion. Drop a comment below. Would you have the courage to do what Helena did? Sacrifice your career for the truth? I want to know your thoughts. It took less than 5 minutes. First, there was a muffled shout from the executive suite, so loud it traveled through the thick walls and down the hall. It was John Boyd's voice, raw and filled with explosive fury. Then, the conference room door burst open and Alan, the general counsel, rushed out, clutching the letter Helena had delivered. He was shouting at Martha, demanding to know who was just on the floor. "Who delivered this? Who the hell is this anonymous source?" Alan roared, his professional composure utterly shattered. Martha, still shaken from her encounter with Helena, pointed a trembling finger toward the HR department. "A woman, a clerk. She just came from that direction. She didn't say anything." Alan didn't waste time going through the proper channels. He stormed down the hall toward HR, waving the paper wildly. "Carol, where is the clerk who just came from the executive floor? I need her name now."
Carol, utterly bewildered by the sudden chaotic invasion of the executive staff, pointed toward Helena's cubicle. Alan stopped in front of Helena's desk. He looked down at the quiet, compliant clerk in the gray suit, who was staring fixedly at her keyboard. He looked at the letter in his hand, then back at Helena. "Did you write this?" Alan demanded, his voice dangerously low. Helena finally looked up. She looked past Alan, toward the hallway, where Mark Jensen and Gary were now standing, looking equally horrified. They had read the letter. They knew the truth, that the financial failure was not just an administrative mishap, but a calculated deception that John was trying to cover up with a cruel lie. Helena didn't flinch. She spoke simply, quietly, her voice barely audible above the ringing silence of the HR office. "I only wrote what was true, Mr. Allen. The CEO's discipline failed. The company's stability is compromised, and Susan Miller is not responsible for the contents of account 8874B. Alan's face went white. He realized in that moment that the quiet, terrified clerk knew everything, and she had just turned the planned firing of Susan Miller into a public referendum on John Boyd's integrity. In the executive suite, John Boyd was still bellowing, demanding that the bank be sued, demanding that the traitor be found. But down in the HR office, the ground had shifted. Mark Jensen, the CFO, stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Alan's shoulder. He looked at Helena, not with anger, but with a strange mix of respect and fear. "Helena," Mark said, his voice measured. "We need to talk, right now, in the conference room." It wasn't a firing. It was an invitation to the inner circle of the crisis. Helena stood up slowly, knowing that her life at Boyd Industries, the quiet, safe, compliant life, was completely over.
She walked past Alan and Mark, heading toward the elevator. The disciplined millionaire had preached that truth and structure were the path to success. Helena, the quiet clerk, had just proven that the truth, when exposed, was the most destructive force of all. The conference break was officially over. The real meeting, the fight for the survival of the company and the soul of its leadership, had just begun, and the lowest employee on the totem pole was now holding the most powerful card. The carpet on the executive floor was silent, thick, and expensive, swallowing the sound of Helena's sensible low heels. She walked past Alan, the general counsel, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes, and entered the conference room. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with the smell of old coffee and high-stakes panic. The room was dominated by a long, polished cherry table. John Boyd was standing at the head of the table, his back to the door, staring out the massive window at the city skyline. When he turned, his face was a terrifying mask. The color had drained completely, leaving his skin stretched tight over his granite jaw, and his eyes were burning with a hatred that was cold, not hot. Mark Jensen, the CFO, and Gary were seated, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Alan closed the door behind Helena, sealing them all in. "This is the clerk?" John's voice was low, strained, and dangerously controlled. It was far more intimidating than his earlier booming rage. Mark nodded, gesturing to a chair near the end of the table. "Helena, please sit down." Helena sat, placing her handbag neatly on the floor beside her. She kept her hands folded in her lap, focusing on the simple, practical reality of the situation, fighting the urge to apologize or flee. John Boyd walked slowly toward her, holding the folded letter, the anonymous report, between his thumb and forefinger, treating it like a poisonous snake.
"You have been with this company 4 years, Miss Helena," John said, not bothering to use her last name. 4 years of quiet, compliant service, collecting a steady paycheck, provided by the discipline and sacrifice I preached this morning, and now you decide to commit corporate sabotage. Why? For a cheap melodrama? To protect a negligent administrator? Helena looked directly at him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just stated the facts, using the precise, emotionless language she used for processing HR forms. "Mr. Boyd, I did not commit sabotage. I reported a violation of the Boyd Industries Code of Conduct, specifically Section 3, Integrity and Transparency in Financial Reporting. The attempt to terminate Susan Miller for gross negligence was a clear, premeditated act to conceal the status of account 8874B, your primary business credit line, which you presented to the public as solvent." John scoffed, a quick, sharp sound of disbelief. "You recognized the notice. You, a junior HR clerk, recognized the details of a highly sensitive commercial bank notice." "Yes, sir," Helena confirmed quietly. "I recognized the emblem, the font, and the nature of the notice. I process similar, though personal, notices weekly. I also recognized that the stated reason for Susan Miller's termination, that she caused the breach of security, was untrue. The breach of stability was caused by the financial status of the company, which was concealed from the employees whose security depends on it." Mark Jensen leaned forward, cutting John off before he could explode. Mark had the look of a man who suddenly realized he was piloting a damaged plane, and the original captain was trying to fight him for the controls.
"Helena is correct, John," Mark said firmly. "We have reviewed the letter. The details she provided about the frozen line and the regulatory requirements are accurate. The fact that she was willing to risk her career to expose the attempted cover-up means that we, as the executive committee, must take immediate action to stabilize the corporate structure and restore faith, both internally and with the bank." John rounded on Mark. "You're siding with a clerk over your CEO? Over the man who built this company?" "I am siding with the continuation of Boyd Industries, John," Mark retorted, his voice steeling. "We are hours away from defaulting on the Indy municipal contract. The bank is already aware of the internal confusion. Your presence here, right now, only exacerbates the instability. They see you as reckless." Alan, the general counsel, chimed in, leaning across the table toward John. John, the bank's legal team is demanding a meeting. They want to see a clear, immediate change in management philosophy. They want to see that the company is taking decisive steps to protect its assets from personal liquidity drains. The implication hung heavy in the air. John's habit of borrowing from the company to fund his extravagant personal lifestyle, the Florida house, the jet, was what had triggered the banking crisis. John's face was a mixture of impotent fury and dawning realization. He was trapped by his own meticulously constructed system of control. He had demanded absolute structure, and now that structure was being used against him by the rules he himself had established. He looked back at Helena, sitting there, small and unmoving. He couldn't intimidate her because she had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from the truth.
"You think you've won, Miss Helena?" John sneered, his voice shaking slightly. "You think you're going to be a hero? You're going to be unemployed and blacklisted by the end of the week. You just sacrificed your career for a moment of self-righteousness." Mark stood up, placing himself physically between John and Helena. This was the moment of the coup. "No, John, you sacrificed your authority," Mark stated, his voice now entirely managerial and professional. "Alan, prepare the paperwork. Effective immediately, John Boyd is taking a mandatory indefinite medical leave of absence. I will assume the role of interim CEO and chairman of the board. We will issue a press release stating that John is stepping down to focus on personal health matters while we navigate a complex period of financial restructuring." John stared at them, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The man who valued control above all else was being summarily removed from his own empire. "You can't do this," John finally choked out. "I own this company." "The bank owns the debt, John," Mark corrected him coldly. "And the board, which I am convening in 1 hour, will agree that the company's survival outweighs your personal control. You will retain your equity, but you will sign over all operational authority, now. Or we let the news break that the CEO of Boyd Industries is facing personal bankruptcy and the company is defaulting on major contracts." John Boyd, the preacher of discipline, slumped into the nearest chair. He had built his world on a lie of perfection. And the moment that lie was exposed by a piece of paper, read aloud by his own 8-year-old daughter, the structure collapsed entirely. He had no leverage left. The transition was swift, brutal, and utterly silent to the public. John Boyd was escorted out of the building an hour later, not by security, but by Alan, the general counsel, carrying a briefcase full of non-disclosure agreements and medical leave forms.
The employees were told, via a company-wide email from Mark Jensen, that John was taking time off and that Mark was now in charge, focusing on aggressive debt resolution and stabilization. The email carefully avoided mentioning the conference or the bank notice, but everyone knew. The whispers went from frantic fear to cautious, almost stunned relief. The tyrant was gone. Helena remained in the executive suite for the rest of the afternoon. She wasn't fired. She was interrogated, not in a hostile way, but as a key witness. Mark Jensen needed her detailed, meticulous memory of the event and the specific financial code she had recognized to help him craft a strategy for dealing with First Commerce and Trust Bank. Around 6 p.m., when the building was mostly empty, Mark sat down across from Helena in the massive conference room, the setting sun casting long orange shadows across the table. "Helena," Mark said, running a tired hand through his gray hair, "you saved Susan Miller's job. And frankly, you saved us from a disastrous PR scandal that would have made the debt 10 times worse. You forced the issue, and you forced it cleanly. We, the executive team, owe you." Helena waited silently. She was prepared for severance, a generous one, provided she signed a lifetime NDA. "Susan Miller is not being terminated," Mark continued. "She will receive an apology and a significant bonus for the stress she endured. As for you," Mark paused, looking at her with genuine curiosity. "You are the most compliant, invisible employee we have, yet you risked everything for integrity. That's rare. That's the kind of discipline John only talked about." Helena finally allowed herself a small, faint expression of relief. "I only wanted to ensure that the rules applied equally, sir, especially the rule about integrity."
"Indeed. Well, the rules are changing now," Mark said. "I need someone who is meticulous, who is terrifyingly detail-oriented, and who has proven they are completely uncorruptible by the internal politics of this place. I need eyes and ears that no one expects to be watching." He slid a contract across the table. "I am establishing a new internal compliance and audit oversight position. It will report directly to me and eventually to the board. It will be the office that ensures we never, ever face a technical misunderstanding like this again. The salary is substantial. The authority is absolute within the company's internal checks. I want you to take it. Helena picked up the contract. The salary was triple her current wage. The title, Director of Internal Compliance, was staggering. It put her, the quiet clerk, in a position of quiet, terrifying power. The perfect role for someone who excelled at noticing what others missed. You won't be in the spotlight, Helena, Mark assured her. You'll be in the shadows, where you're most effective. You'll be the person who checks the paperwork before it ever gets near the lectern. Helena looked at the contract, then back at Mark. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a sense of professional purpose. She had spent 4 years fearing mistakes. Now, her job was to find everyone else's. I accept, Mr. Jensen, Helena said, her voice steady. Good, Mark sighed, a weight visibly lifting from his shoulders. Now, the first thing we need to do is audit John's personal expenses for the last 3 years. I need every single document, every receipt, every piece of paper he tried to hide. I need to know exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes.
The following Monday, the atmosphere at Boyd Industries was entirely different. It was quieter, less tense, and, paradoxically, more focused. The fear of John Boyd's perfection had been replaced by the sober realization that they were all fighting for survival under Mark Jensen's pragmatic leadership. The mandatory conferences were canceled indefinitely. The word discipline was replaced by accountability. Helena arrived at her new office on the executive floor. It was small, tucked away, and had a lockable door, a place for quiet, meticulous work. She looked down at her desk. There were no stacks of glossy, self-aggrandizing manifestos, just a new, high-security shredder and a clean, organized workspace. She was no longer the frightened junior clerk who worried about spilling coffee. She was the watchdog, the quiet guardian of the company's actual financial integrity, not its manufactured identity. She heard a small knock on her door. It was Susan Miller, the administrative assistant. Susan looked nervous but relieved. "Helena," Susan whispered, stepping inside. I wanted to thank you. Carol told me what you did. I don't know how you knew or why you risked it, but you saved me. You saved my family." Helena offered Susan a rare, small smile. "I just read the fine print, Susan. That's all." Susan nodded, still slightly awestruck by the quiet quirk who had taken down the CEO. "I'm sorry, but I still have to ask," Susan said hesitantly. "What happened to that piece of paper, the bank notice, the one John was holding?" Helena walked over to a small, fireproof safe installed in the corner of her new office. She opened it. Inside, neatly filed and labeled under Case File, Boyd Regulatory Action, was the single, folded piece of cheap, off-white paper. Helena carefully took it out. The stylized eagle emblem of First Commerce and Trust Bank seemed less intimidating now. It was just evidence.
This piece of paper, Helena said, holding it up, is the most valuable asset Boyd Industries currently owns. It's the proof that the emperor had no clothes, and it is the permanent record of why we will never confuse identity with reality again. She folded the paper back up, placed it securely in the safe, and locked the door with a satisfying click. John Boyd had preached that discipline guaranteed wealth and moral authority. But Helena, the quiet clerk, who had simply done her job by observing the truth, had proven that true authority wasn't built on a granite jaw or a booming voice. It was built on a foundation of simple, undeniable facts and the courage to speak them, even if you had to whisper them into the center of a storm. The age of the flawless patriarch was over. The age of quiet, meticulous accountability had begun. Helena sat back down at her desk, opened the audit file on John Boyd's personal accounts, and began to work. The new discipline was silent, and it was absolute. If this story impacted you, share it with someone who needs to understand that truth always wins in the end. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. See you in the next story.